The main and fundamental task of agrarian reform was the fundamental reorganization of the land use and land ownership of the peasantry. The system of communal land ownership. The community regularly redistributed land between peasants' farms in accordance with the size of family, number of workers, and the size of taxes. The high birth rate was the constant shortage of land allotments in the central provinces of Russia. Since 1893, redistribution were allowed to be carried out no more often than every 12 years. The desire to equalize the economic usefulness of a plot allocated to each individual farms led to the unfavorable phenomenon of strip land ownership. The meaning of strip land ownership is that all the lands of the community are cut into several large plots. With each of these, the land is considered to be in the plot. The land is cut into narrow strip according to the number of farms. The area of a strip is proportional to the number of workers. Peasants had to cultivate up to 30 land fields scattered across different places, which had an extremely unfavorable effect on the efficiency of agriculture. The state in most cases deal only with the rural community as a whole. The amount of taxes and municipal fees was calculated for the community. All members of a rural community were bound for municipal responsibility. The community bore collective responsibility for the payment of all types of taxes and redemption payment by all its membership. Form of land ownership characterized by the ownership of certain land plot by peasant community was outdated. Peasant community, or mir, is a unit of administrative and economic self-government of peasant and Russian Empire. The village meeting in the organ of peasant self-government. It united all peasants' householders and elected the village elder and other officials. The village meeting was subject to all matter related to the communal use of mere land, land redistribution, determination of rulers, sales, purchases, and so on. The fight against strip farming by means of the complete distribution of communal and land became one of the main tasks of the agrarian reform of Minister of Internal Affairs Stolypin. The most important relief social tension in the village and create a support base for the authorities in the form of broad layers of a peasantry. In practice, the agrarian reform included a number of major measures defined by the Legislative Act 1906-1911. The decree November 9, 1996 testified to the fact that the authorities had abandoned the old policy of preserving the community and had moved to the supporting the small private owner. The main components of Stolypin agrarian reform were: first, for peasants to leave the community by allocating own plot, so-called kat, otrup, to each household. A peasant who left the community became a private owner of the land with the village without moving the estate in the case of an kat. A kat is the most compact arrangement of land. A farmstead is an isolated peasant farm, outside the village without connection with the community. Several households with separate land ownership formed a farmstead. In the case of farmstead, there were new undeveloped land. Stolypin often mixed the concept in his lawmaking. Second, compulsory land measurement. If peasants declared his desire to leave the community, then, despite the objection of the village assembly, the land management commissions consolidated the peasants' land plots into one place. Straightening the peasant bank, which provided low-interest loan to the peasants who had separated from the community on preferential terms with payment differences from up to 50 years. Resettlement policy. It's one of the most important and one of the most interesting measures of Stolypin's reform. The reform unfolded in favored conditions. The agricultural crisis in Europe had ended. Since 1907, redemption payment, which had been a heavy burden on peasants' farmers, were abolished. The government intensified the activities of a peasant bank, to which landowners, Russian nobles, frightened by the agrarian pogroms, sold their estates after 1950. The peasant bank curated about 4 million desitin, It's a Russian unit of land area, especially about 1 hectare of land, which was sold or leased to peasants in need. The most important part of the agrarian reform was a resettlement policy. In a short period of time, 1906-1914, more than 3 million families, it's about 12-15 million people, moved to the new lands in Siberian, Caucasus, Kazakhstan and the Far East and developed 30 million descents of land. The resettlement was carried out with the state support. The treasury paid for the transportation of people and their property. The state carried out work to create infrastructure of new lands. Schools, roads, medical stations were built. The land plots of the settlers were significantly larger than in Europe, Russian. In new lands, large, highly commercial peasants farm grew up in a short period of time. Siberia not only began to feed itself, but also to export significant amounts of agricultural products, grain, oil, to Europe, part of Russia and abroad. The grain harvest in 1913 was about 1/3 higher than in the USA, Canada and Argentina combined. The country exported 10-11 million tons of grain annually, which is approximately half of all its world exports. Stolypin agrarian reform was not easy. The difficulties in its implementation were associated with many reasons. The lack of funds allocated by the state for the reforms had an effect. There was an acute shortage of people capable and willing to implement it. Nevertheless, the reform was the most effective of all the agrarian reforms that were carried out in Russia before and after. Another important result of Stolypin agrarian reform was the growth of a cooperative movement in the Russian village. Cooperatives were created for the sale of agricultural products, their primary processing, the purchase of industrial goods, including machinery. In direct connection with agricultural reforms, Stolypin developed and began to implement other reforms to expand the representatives of peasants in zemstvo institution, improve legal procedure, and introduce compulsory, universal, and free primary education. The reforms carried out by Stolypin's government and he himself were subject to sharp attacks from both the left and the right. The Socialist Party, without denying the economic feasibility of reforms, were afraid of losing the social base of the revolution in the village and focused their criticism on the social side of issues. The right-wing reactionary force saw that activity opposition the reforms of local government and the court. There was strong resistance from below disconnect in the communities. The tendency of a communal order, its inherent leveling, had an effect. Here, in the southern and southeastern provinces, the widespread distribution of farmstead was hampered by difficulties with the water. But where in the North Caucasus, in the steppe Trans-Volga region and the northern Black Sea region, the planting of carts developed quite successfully. The fertile steppe, flat as a table, was created for the cart farming. In the central Black Earth provinces, the main obstacles to the formation of farmstead and carts on communal lands was the peasants' shortage of land. It's